My name is Margaret Warren, and the night my brother's lawyer handed me my father's gold watch, it started ticking again after 30 years of silence. I didn't even wind it. The sound came on its own, faint but steady, like a heartbeat I hadn't heard since I was 25. It shouldn't have been possible. The watch had stopped the day we buried my father, and for 3 decades it stayed still, locked inside a cedar box I could barely look at. But that night, when the lawyer said Edward wanted you to have this and slid the old thing across his desk, I swear it came back to life in my hands. The office smelled like furniture polish and paper. I remember the lawyer, Mr. Dillard, glancing at the watch like it might stain his files. "Your brother mentioned this a few days before he passed," he said. He wanted it delivered personally. His tone was stiff, lawyer stiff. But I could tell even he felt the weight of it. Edward and I hadn't spoken in years. Not since the day he told me, "You got the heart, I got the land," as if fairness were a coin toss. When I left the office, the sky was bruised purple over the cornfields. Indiana summers can cling to you like guilt, and that night was no different. The air felt thick, the kind that sticks to your skin. I drove home with the watch on the passenger seat, the ticking filling the quiet of my old Ford. Every few seconds, the rhythm faltered, then caught itself again, like it was struggling to remember how to live. I live alone in the house my father built. It's not much, but it's solid white siding a wraparound porch and the same walnut tree that's been shading it since 1959. When I got home, I placed the watch on the kitchen table and turned on the porch light. The bulb flickered once before it steadied. For some reason, that flicker made my chest tighten. Maybe it was memory, or maybe it was the thought of Edward gone. We'd fought over everything after our parents died, land, furniture, even who got to keep the family photo albums. I always told myself the watch didn't matter. But now, with it ticking in front of me, I wasn't so sure. I made a pot of coffee, even though it was late. The ticking filled the silence between the percolations. I could almost hear my father's voice again, the low rumble of his laughter, when he said, "Time's the one thing you can't fix, kiddo." He used to polish that watch every Sunday, sitting in his recliner, while Edward and I watched TV. I'd trace the engraved initials on the back JHW and imagine it held secrets from a life before me. I turned the watch over now and noticed something I'd never seen before, faint etching along the bottom rim, just visible under the lamplight. It wasn't my father's handwriting. The letters were sharper, uneven. I leaned closer and made out 4 words. "For the one who took everything." My heart stuttered. That phrase carved into a gift that had always been mine, or was it ever? It didn't make sense. I told myself, maybe Edward had done it. He was always dramatic like that. But still, it felt like a message from the grave. I carried the watch to the living room and sat on the edge of my father's old recliner. The leather creaked like a sigh. The ticking seemed louder now, like it had found its confidence. I tried to remember the last time I saw Edward. It was Thanksgiving 7 years ago. He'd brought his wife Linda and bragged about how well the farm was doing. He'd asked if I still had the watch, and when I said yes, he smiled oddly. "Guess you got the only thing that still works," he said. I laughed then, but it didn't sound like a joke anymore. The night stretched long. I couldn't sleep, so I set the watch on my nightstand. Around midnight, I woke to silence. It had stopped again. I picked it up, held it close to my ear. Nothing. I don't know why, but that quiet made me angry. Angry at Edward, at my father, at all the unfinished words between us. I shook the watch once hard. And there it was again, a single stubborn tick. By morning, the sky had turned a pale gray, the kind that smells like rain before it falls. I poured coffee and sat by the window. The ticking continued steady as a pulse. I thought about how strange it was that after 3 decades of silence, the watch came back the same week my brother died. Maybe coincidence, maybe something else. Either way, it felt like a door had cracked open somewhere in the past, and I couldn't unhear what was coming through. That afternoon, I took the watch into town. The jewelry shop on Main Street hadn't changed since high school. The same brass bell jingled when I opened the door. Behind the counter stood Mr. Hensley, gray-haired, stooped, but still sharp-eyed. He looked up, squinted, and said, "Well, I'll be damned. Haven't seen that piece in 30 years. He remembered it instantly. Said my father used to bring it in for cleaning every year until he passed. When I told him it had started ticking again, he raised an eyebrow. Not possible unless someone wound it or replaced the spring. I swore I hadn't touched a thing. He took out his magnifier, turned the watch over, and froze. "Who added this?" he asked, pointing to the engraving. "That's what I want to know," I said. He leaned closer. "Your father asked me to engrave his initials, nothing more. But this," he traced the words. "For the one who took everything, I didn't do that." He handed it back carefully like it might burn. "Be careful with that, Margaret. Some things are meant to stay quiet." I didn't answer. I just slipped the watch into my pocket, feeling its weight like a heartbeat against my palm. Outside, the sky finally broke into rain, soft and relentless. I walked home slower than usual, the sound of each drop mingling with the steady ticking in my coat. And somewhere between the raindrops and the ticking, I began to wonder what exactly had my brother taken, and what did my father mean to give back? The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Hensley had said. Be careful with that, some things are meant to stay quiet. But the words on the back of that watch wouldn't leave me alone. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the engraving, "For the one who took everything." I wasn't sure if the message was meant for Edward or for me, but it felt like something poisonous was sitting on my kitchen table. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and spread out the old papers I'd pulled from the attic. Bill's property deeds, a few letters from my father's years at the county office. Nothing unusual. Still, the sound of the watch in my pocket made me restless. It was ticking again, louder than before. I decided to go through the old trunk at the back of the attic, the one that hadn't been opened since the funeral. Dust came up like smoke when I pried the lid open. Inside were yellowed envelopes, photographs, and a small leather ledger I didn't remember ever seeing. The handwriting inside was my father's, neat and deliberate. He'd kept notes about harvest yields, local debts, and bank payments. But halfway through, a page stopped me cold. My name, Margaret, written in ink beside the description of the family farm, the same farm Edward had inherited. Next to it, in smaller letters, the words, "Final draft pending." My stomach knotted. I turned the page, but the rest of the book was blank. The attic air was dry and heavy. For a long minute, I just sat there, listening to the faint ticking from downstairs. My father's voice seemed to echo in the dust. "Time's the one thing you can't fix, kiddo." Maybe he'd tried to fix something else instead. Maybe this ledger was the real will, the one Edward never wanted found. I called the county clerk's office. The woman who answered, Mrs. Daly, sounded older, patient, but cautious. "Property records from 1993, she repeated. "We still have microfilm copies, but it'll take a few days." I thanked her and hung up. My hands were shaking, not from anger exactly, but from the sense that I was peeling back a piece of the past no one wanted touched. That afternoon, I drove to the farm. The gravel driveway looked the same, muddy ruts, wild weeds, the mailbox leaning. Linda, my sister-in-law, answered the door. She looked thinner than I remembered, tired in a way grief alone doesn't explain. "Margaret?" she said, voice flat but polite. "You didn't have to drive out here." "I just wanted to return a few of Edward's things," I said. It was partly true. I had a small box of his papers from Dad's old desk. We sat in the kitchen, the same room where I'd spent half my childhood. The clock above the stove had stopped at 4:10. Ironic, I thought. Linda poured sweet tea, her hands trembling. "He'd been talking a lot about your dad before he passed," she said quietly. "Something about making things right." "Did he ever mention the watch?" I asked. Her eyes flicked to mine, then away. "He said it would find its way back to you, that's all." I reached into my purse and placed the watch on the table. It ticked once loud in the silence and then kept going, steady as ever. Linda's face went pale. "That sound," she whispered, "he used to say, it drove him crazy." "Why?" She bit her lip. "He thought the watch was cursed." She gave a nervous laugh that died in her throat. "He said every time he wound it, something bad happened. The barn fire, then the tractor accident, then, well, the heart attack." I wanted to tell her that superstition doesn't scare me, that guilt makes its own ghosts, but the words wouldn't come. The watch seemed to tick louder between us. When I got home, I laid the ledger next to the watch on my kitchen table. Side by side, they looked like a conversation frozen in time, something my father had started and my brother had tried to finish. I couldn't help thinking about the phrase, "for the one who took everything." Maybe Dad had written it not out of anger, but as a warning. Maybe Edward had taken more than property. That night, thunder rolled across the fields. I couldn't sleep, so I sat by the window, watching the porch light glow against the rain. The watch ticked beside me. Each sound felt like a pulse through the house. I whispered into the quiet, "All right, Dad. I'm listening." The next morning, I took the ledger to the library. The archivist, an older gentleman named Harold Briggs, helped me scan the pages. "Old ink like this doesn't fade evenly," he said, peering through his glasses. "See here, someone erased something and rewrote it." He pointed to a faint indentation under the word Margaret. With gentle light adjustment, the hidden words appeared original beneficiary. My knees went weak. So it was true. My father had meant for me to inherit the farm. Somewhere between his draft and the official signing, that plan changed. And only one person had reason to make sure it did Edward. Driving home, the summer air felt heavier than ever. The watch ticked steadily in my pocket, and I realized I wasn't hearing time anymore. I was hearing my father, not haunting me, guiding me, telling me that truth has its own rhythm. One no lie can silence forever. When I reached my porch, I looked down the long gravel road and whispered, "You took everything, Edward." But maybe not for long. The following morning, sunlight slanted across my kitchen table, catching the edges of the gold watch like a blade. The ticking hadn't stopped all night. It seemed louder now, like it had something to say. I sat there with my coffee growing cold, staring at it until I finally whispered, "All right, Dad. Show me what I'm missing." The answer came from a place I hadn't looked in years, the locked file cabinet in my father's old workshop out back. The smell of oil and cedar hit me as soon as I opened the door. His workbench was still cluttered with coffee cans full of screws, the wall lined with tools that hadn't been touched since the week he died. The lock on the file cabinet was rusty, but the key was still hanging from a nail above it, like he'd known I'd need it someday. Inside, most of the drawers were filled with bank statements and utility bills, but the bottom one had a thick envelope marked "Private." My father's handwriting was unmistakable, clean, deliberate, the kind of penmanship schools don't teach anymore. I hesitated before sliding it open. Inside were copies of property deeds dated months before his death. And there it was, again, my name, not Edward's. Mine. The farm. The house. Even a life insurance policy naming me as the secondary beneficiary. It felt like the air had been knocked out of me. All these years I'd believed Dad had favored Edward, that the watch was just his way of tossing me something small. But it wasn't small. It was the one thing Edward hadn't managed to steal. My hands shook as I read the note tucked at the bottom. If you're reading this, Margaret Time has finally told its truth. Don't let the loudest voice in the room decide what's fair. You know who you are. I sank down onto the stool by the workbench. The watch in my pocket ticked steadily like it was keeping me company. You tried to warn me, I whispered. But I wasn't listening. That afternoon, I drove back into town to see Mr. Hensley again. The bell above his door jingled and he looked up with that same curious frown. Something wrong with the watch again, he asked. Not exactly, I said. I just need to know the truth. Did my father ever say anything strange when he brought this in? Anything about a message? He set down his magnifier. Your father wasn't much for talk. But I do remember something. The last time he came in, maybe a month before he passed, he asked me if I knew how to hide words under metal. Hide them, I repeated. He nodded. He said he wanted something private, something only time would uncover. I thought he was joking. Did he say what it was? Mr. Hensley shook his head, just smiled and said, She'll know when it ticks again? I assumed he meant you. The words sent a chill through me. She'll know when it ticks again. I thanked him and left the summer air feeling thick and electric. As I crossed Main Street, the noon church bells began to ring. The rhythm almost matched the ticking in my hand. Back home, I opened my laptop and searched county archives for the official record of my father's will. It had been signed and notarized 3 days before his stroke, Edward listed as primary heir. But the notary's name jumped out at me, Linda Carter, my brother's wife. My pulse quickened. Linda wasn't just a witness, she was the one who had filed the paperwork. I sat back in my chair, the realization settling in like a weight. If Linda had helped change the documents, then Edward hadn't acted alone. Maybe they'd both known what they'd done. Maybe that's why Edward had died with a guilty conscience. The next morning, I called Linda. I need to talk, I said. She hesitated. About what? About Dad. About what really happened. There was a long silence before she said, Come by the house around 3. When I arrived, she was waiting on the porch, her hands clasped tight. The farm looked smaller than I remembered, lonelier. We sat at the kitchen table again, the same spot as before. But this time, the air between us felt different. I found Dad's original papers, I said, with my name on them. Linda's face went pale. I told him it was wrong, she whispered. Edward said it didn't matter that your father would have changed his mind anyway. So you both filed the false one. Tears welled in her eyes. I signed because I was scared. Edward said we'd lose everything if we didn't. He said your father promised it to him. She wiped her face. He carried that guilt for years, Margaret. He used to wake up in the middle of the night talking about the watch. Said he could still hear it ticking. I wanted to be angry, but mostly I just felt tired. You should have told me, I said softly. I know, she whispered. He wanted to. He even started writing you a letter before he died. Burned it the same night. The sound of the clock on her wall filled the silence between us. When I finally stood to leave, Linda reached out and touched my arm. I think he wanted you to forgive him, she said. He just didn't know how to ask. I didn't answer. Outside, the wind carried the smell of cut hay and distant rain. The watch ticked in my pocket, slow, steady, alive. Maybe forgiveness wasn't something I could give yet. Maybe time had a few more things left to say first. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of ticking and sleepless nights. Every time I tried to rest, the watch would find a new voice, steady, persistent, a whisper through metal. I'd always believed guilt fades with time, but now I wasn't so sure. Some sounds, once they start, don't stop until you've faced what they're trying to say. I decided I wasn't done with Linda. There were still too many loose threads: the burned letter, the will she'd helped file, the half-truths sitting between us like dust. When I called, she didn't answer. So the next morning, I drove back to the farm. The front gate was open. For a moment, I thought the place looked exactly as it had when Dad was alive, the same walnut tree, the same swing creaking in the breeze. But the closer I got, the more I saw the neglect-chipped paint weeds curling around the steps. Time eats everything if you let it. I found Linda in the barn sorting through boxes. She looked startled when she saw me. "I'm not here to fight," I said quietly. "I just need to understand." She sighed and motioned for me to sit on an old stool. "Edward never forgave himself," she said. "Your father left 2 envelopes with his lawyer. One went missing before the reading of the will. Edward said he just took it. He couldn't stand the idea of losing what he thought was his." "Did he ever open it?" I asked. She shook her head. "He said he didn't need to. He just burned it." She looked down, twisting her wedding ring. "That's the night the watch stopped ticking in this house." A chill ran down my arms. I thought about the engraving, "For the one who took everything." My father had known. Maybe he hadn't planned revenge. Maybe he'd just trusted time to do it for him. When I got home, I set the watch on the kitchen table again. The rain had started up outside, soft and rhythmic. I remembered being a little girl lying on my father's lap as he polished the watch, listening to the rain and the steady beat of time. He'd said, "Someday this will tell you something important, Margaret. Not about time, about truth." I picked up the ledger again, flipping through the empty pages at the back. Something crinkled near the binding. I tugged gently and found a folded slip of paper wedged inside. It was brittle with age, but the ink was still clear. "If anything happens to me, show this to Hensley. He'll know what it means." The next morning, I was back at the jewelry shop before it opened. Mr. Hensley looked both curious and weary when he saw me walk in. "You're persistent," he said. I handed him the note. His brow furrowed as he read it. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "He told me once he wanted to leave you something only you'd understand." He disappeared into the back room and returned with an old logbook, yellowed with grease and time. "Every repair I've ever done is in here," he said, flipping pages until he found one marked Warren J.H. He traced a line with his finger. 2 service entries, same watch. One for regular cleaning, then one just a week before he died. He asked me to replace the faceplate. When I did, he slid a tiny piece of paper inside. Told me not to read it. Said you'd come back one day. My throat tightened. "Is it still there?" He nodded slowly. "If you trust me, I can open it carefully." I did. The sound of his tools filled the room, small clicks, the faint hum of patience. Finally, he lifted the glass face away and pulled out a slip no bigger than a postage stamp. He handed it to me with tweezers. The ink had faded, but I could still make out the words. "Truth isn't lost. It's buried under greed. Let time uncover it." I stared at the message until the letters blurred. He knew I whispered. Mr. Hensley folded my hands around the watch. "Your father was a decent man, Margaret. He trusted the right person would hear it tick again." On the drive home, I passed the county records office. The thought hit me hard: if Edward had filed a false will, maybe the real one had never been destroyed. I parked and walked inside. The clerk on duty, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I need to look at property filings from 1993, I said. "Anything under Joseph H. Warren." He scrolled through his database, frowning. "That's odd. There's a sealed file here, dated 2 days after the final will was processed. Says, 'Held pending dispute.' But there's no record of the dispute ever being resolved." My pulse quickened. "Can I see it?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "You're listed as next of kin. I don't see why not." He disappeared into the back and returned with a slim, dust-covered envelope stamped "County Archive Copy." My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was a notarized document with my father's signature, dated the week before his death. It clearly named me as the rightful heir to the family property. My father hadn't failed me after all. He'd simply trusted that truth like a watch would keep ticking until the right moment. I stepped out of the office into the golden light of late afternoon. The watch ticked warmly in my hand, no longer accusing, just alive. I whispered, "I hear you, Dad," loud and clear. The next few days felt like walking through fog, each step revealing more than I wanted to see. The truth was out there now, written in county ink, stamped and real. But it didn't feel like justice yet. It felt unfinished, like the ticking of the watch when it skipped a beat. That Friday, I drove back to see Mr. Hensley one more time. He was polishing the front display when I walked in, the little bell jingling overhead. He smiled softly. "I wondered when you'd be back," he said. "Something tells me your father's story isn't done." He wasn't wrong. I laid the official document on his counter, still folded. "I found the original will," I said. Edward hid it. My father really did leave the farm to me. Mr. Hensley exhaled, his shoulders sinking like a man setting down a heavy box. Then he was right to trust time. I looked around the small shop, the glass cases, the clocks lining the walls, each one ticking at its own pace. "You said your old assistant might remember something," I reminded him. His face lit up with memory. "Right, Mabel. She's at Rosewood Nursing now. Sharp as ever, though she forgets what day it is sometimes." An hour later, I was sitting in a floral-scented common room surrounded by crocheted blankets and muted television noise. A nurse led me to Mabel, a petite woman with silver hair and eyes that still sparked like match heads. "I remember your father," she said before I'd even finished introducing myself. "He always carried that gold watch. Said it was the only thing that listened." That line stopped me cold. The only thing that listened. She nodded, smiling faintly. "He used to talk to it while I cleaned the counters. Said time was honest even when people weren't. One day he came in quiet, real serious. Asked me if secrets could tick. What did you tell him, I asked. That secrets stop ticking the moment you lie, she said. Then he laughed. But not the happy kind. The kind that sounds like goodbye. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Do you remember what he had engraved that day? Her gaze drifted toward the window. He asked Hensley to make a second engraving under the first. Told him, she'll find it when the time's right. Those words felt like they'd been following me for weeks, like a message I was just now learning to hear. When I left Rosewood, the air outside smelled of cut grass and rain-soaked pavement. The watch ticked steadily in my palm, its rhythm matching my heartbeat. That evening, I sat at my father's old desk, with both documents in front of me, the fraudulent will that Edward filed and the real one my father left. The contrast between them was almost painful. Edward's version was cold-typed and notarized by convenience. My father's was written in ink that bled slightly into the paper, his signature looping with care. I could have gone to court right then. The law would have sided with me easily. But revenge didn't feel right, not yet. What I wanted was understanding, and maybe forgiveness. The next morning, I drove back to the farm one last time. Linda was on the porch, watering a few potted plants that had clearly seen better days. When she saw me, her expression flickered, somewhere between fear and relief. I know everything I said quietly, holding up the envelope. The real will, the engraving, the watch, everything. She put down the watering can, her eyes shining with tears. I didn't want it to go that way, Margaret. I told him not to change it. I believe you, I said, surprising both of us. But I need to see where he burned the letter. She led me inside to the living room fireplace. The grate was clean now, but I could still see faint scorch marks climbing up the brick. She reached into a nearby drawer and pulled out a small metal tin. Inside were ashes and a single corner of burnt paper. I couldn't throw it away, she said. The fire didn't take all of it. The remaining scrap was no larger than a matchbook. I brushed away the ash and could barely make out the words written in Edward's hand. You were right, Dad. She deserved. And then it ended. I stood there for a long time listening to the sound of rain against the window. Then I said what I hadn't been able to say before he knew. He knew what he'd done. Linda nodded, tears spilling down her face. He carried that guilt every day. I placed the gold watch on the mantel. Then maybe it's time to stop carrying it. When I got home that night, I sat on the porch, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and fading daylight. The watch ticked quietly beside me. I opened the cedar box for the first time in years and set it inside next to the ledger and the letter from my father. For the first time since Edward's death, I slept through the night. The following week passed in quiet determination. I woke early each morning, made coffee, and laid the real will on the table where the watch used to rest. Every time the sun came through the curtains, I'd trace my father's signature and think about all the years I'd spent believing I'd been forgotten. But now that I had proof, I wasn't sure what to do with it. Justice can be a heavy thing when it finally lands in your lap. I called the county office again. If I submit this, I asked the clerk, will it reopen the estate? He said yes, but it would mean lawyers' fees. Headlines in a town where everyone still knew my father's name. I thanked him and hung up. I sat there staring at the phone, hearing the tick that wasn't there anymore. I could almost imagine the watch saying, "Not like this, Margaret." So instead of calling an attorney, I called Linda. "I'm coming over," I said. She didn't argue. When I arrived, she was sitting on the porch, her hands folded in her lap. The sun was setting behind the barn, spreading gold over everything. "You look like him," she said softly when I sat down. That same calm before a storm. "I'm not here to start one," I said. "I just want to end it right." I handed her a copy of the real will. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she whispered, "He'd want you to have it." I nodded. "I'm not taking the farm back, Linda. You've lived here too long." But the truth needed to be said out loud. Tears filled her eyes. "What will you do now?" "Keep the land in the family," I said. "I'll refile the deed so it names us both. You can stay, and I'll make sure Dad's name stays on the mailbox." For the first time in months, she smiled, small but real. "He'd like that," she said. That night, I brought the watch out one last time. It lay open in my palm, silent now, but the face gleamed in the lamplight. I turned it over and read the engraving again. For the one who took everything. Then I understood. It had never been about punishment. It was about ownership, not of property, but of the truth. My father hadn't meant to condemn Edward. He'd meant to remind me that greed can take everything from a family unless someone stops it. The next morning, I went down to the courthouse and recorded the deed transfer. The clerk smiled politely as she stamped the papers, unaware she was closing a wound 30 years deep. I stepped out into the sunlight, the sound of the clock tower echoing over Main Street. For the first time, it didn't sound like a countdown. It sounded like release. When I got home, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The fields stretched out before me, glowing under the afternoon sun. I opened the cedar box one final time, placed the watch inside, and whispered, "You've done enough." The lid clicked shut, and in the stillness that followed, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. Later, when the wind picked up, I thought I heard it again, a single soft tick. Maybe memory, maybe imagination, or maybe just time saying, "Thank you." I looked out over the land my father built and said quietly, "You were right, Dad. Some truths don't need revenge. They just need time." Then I turned off the porch light and let the evening come. The next morning, I woke to sunlight spilling through the curtains and the scent of dew drifting in from the fields. It was the first time in years I hadn't woken to the sound of something ticking beside me. The gold watch lay quiet in its cedar box, finally at rest. But somehow I didn't need it anymore. The truth had already done its work. I sat on the porch steps with my coffee, listening to the wind rustle through the walnut tree. For decades, that tree had heard everything: arguments, laughter, silence. Now it just stood there, steady and forgiving, like time itself. I thought about my father, about how he must have felt knowing he wouldn't live long enough to make things right. Maybe that's why he trusted time to do what he couldn't. After breakfast, I drove back to town to see Mr. Hensley one last time. The bell above the shop door jingled the same soft chime that had marked every chapter of this story. He looked up from his workbench, wiping his hands. "I figured I might see you again," he said, with a knowing smile. I placed the watch on the counter. "It's finished," I said. He lifted it carefully, inspecting the surface under the lamplight. "Looks like it's at peace," he murmured. "You keeping it this time?" I shook my head. "I think it belongs here. You were part of this from the start. Maybe let it sit in your window where people can see it. A reminder." He smiled softly. "A reminder of what?" "That truth always finds its way back," I said. He nodded. "That's a good story to keep ticking." When I left the shop, the town square was alive with Saturday morning errands. Farmers loading feed kids running with ice cream cones. A young couple taking engagement photos by the courthouse fountain. I hadn't realized how much life had gone on while I was stuck in the past. At the diner on Maple Street, I slid into my usual booth. The waitress Nancy refilled my coffee and asked how I'd been. "Better," I said. And I meant it. She told me about her granddaughter's wedding, and for once I listened without drifting into old thoughts. The world hadn't changed, but I had. Later that afternoon, I drove back home and parked at the edge of the field. The air smelled like sun-warmed hay and rain about to fall. I walked along the fence line, running my hand over the weathered posts. In the distance, the farmhouse stood exactly as it always had, quiet waiting. Linda came out onto the porch and waved. I waved back. We didn't need words anymore. The papers had been filed, the truth recorded, the family name shared again. That was enough. As the clouds gathered, I sat on the steps and watched the first drops hit the porch rail. The rain sounded like applause, soft, steady, forgiving. I realized then that time hadn't taken everything from us. It had simply demanded its turn. That evening, I took out my father's ledger one last time. Inside the cover, I wrote a single line beneath his handwriting. The truth came home. Then I closed it, wrapped it in brown paper, and placed it back inside the cedar box. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft patter of rain. When I turned off the lamp, a faint sound came from the box. One gentle tick, then silence. I smiled through tears I didn't bother wiping away. "Good night, Dad," I whispered. "We're all square now." Outside, lightning flashed somewhere beyond the fields, and the air filled with that rare, clean scent that only comes after a storm. I thought about everything that had led me here: the lies, the silence, the discovery, the forgiveness. It hadn't been revenge, not really. It had been reckoning. And that's what he'd wanted all along. Before heading to bed, I walked out onto the porch one last time. The porch light glowed warm against the dark, and the night stretched wide over Indiana. I looked out across the fields and spoke softly, like I was talking to someone still listening. Some wounds don't close fast, but truth has patience. It waits. And when it's ready, it knocks. I turned to the camera of memory in my mind, the one I always imagine watching me from somewhere out there in the dark, and gave a small nod like the ending of a confession. If you've ever had something stolen from you, your peace, your family, your story, don't rush your revenge. Let time work. Let truth breathe. Because one day it'll start ticking again, just when you least expect it. And when it does listen,